Well, good evening, everybody. Good to see all y'all. And if you're watching online tonight, glad you could be joining us as well. Hope you all are having a great evening and everything's going pretty smoothly. We're going to jump in tonight into our study of 1 Thessalonians. We're in chapter 4. So as you do that, we'll open up tonight with some prayer as well. Heavenly Father, we are grateful tonight to be able to gather together to laugh. Lord, there's lots of laughter going on here, and we're just having a good time, fellowship with one another, and looking forward to what you have to say to us through your word. I pray that you would guide our conversation tonight, and that your Spirit would lead us through your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Just that if you're watching online tonight and you couldn't hear it, they're just laughter, especially on this side over here. Everybody's just laughing over here. It's really great. I don't know what they're laughing at. Maybe it's me. They're all pointing to Ernie. You imagine that? They just called you out, didn't they? We are in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I saw a story this morning, or this afternoon. There was a semi-accident in Utah that was a truck overturned carrying a load of baking flour. They all got there, and apparently they had a really hard time getting that stuff off the road. It was just caked on. Some of y'all laughed. Some of you are thinking about it for a second. But it was a real thing. I made the punchline up, but the rest of the story was true. I don't know. Well, when we look at our passages, I'm not sure that has anything to do with our passage tonight, but sometimes you just like telling stories. So we are in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We looked at the first 8 verses last week. And so we'll look at verses 9 to 12 tonight. So I want to read those 4 verses. I'm going to go back and pick up some things from last week. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. Now as to the love of the brethren, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. For indeed you do practice it toward all the brethren who are in all Macedonia. But we urge you, brethren, to excel still more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, and to attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we commanded you, so that you will behave properly toward outsiders and not be in any need. So as we began this chapter, we saw Paul state one of God's purposes for us. And we know there's a couple different things that God intends for us as his people. But last week we spent some time on this, and in chapter 4, verse 3, Paul makes this statement: this is the will of God for you, your sanctification, or we could say your holiness. Now, Paul spent the next few verses there in chapter 3, or after verse 3, detailing the first way he wanted to talk about that sanctification. But before we even review that, I want us to think for a few moments what it means that today, one of God's primary goals for us, that as we walk through a daily life, is our sanctification, our becoming holy. That this is one of God's goals. Now, we can read any number of books, we can read any number of Bible studies, we can watch any number of sermons and on TV or online or whatever else, and there's going to be lots of information about all the great plans God has for you. And a lot of those are fine, and some of them are ignoring the Bible in the process, but Paul tells us here in chapter 4, verse 3, that one of God's goals or one of God's purposes for us in this life is our becoming holy. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week, and we recognized last week that in order to become holy, holiness is, of all the character traits in Scripture that are attributed to God, God is love, God is compassionate, He's merciful, He's forgiving, all these things. The one trait, the one characteristic that supersedes all of them is holiness. If we were to say there is one trait, but all the other traits of God are defined by, it is His holiness. It's the one trait that is emphasized. He's holy, holy, holy. It's the Bible's way of saying it's all caps, bold, underlined, holy. And so his love, his mercy, his compassion, all these other traits are subsumed or defined first by his holiness. It's the one trait above all else. Doesn't mean that those other things aren't true, but it begins with holiness. And so if we want to be holy, if we are moving towards holiness, it's going to require a knowledge of and knowing God. He is the source of holiness. There is no holiness apart from God. And so if God's purpose for us, as stated here in 4:3, is holiness, we understand we can't get there short of knowing God. We're going to have to know him. We're going to have to relate to him. We're going to have to grow in our understanding of who he is. If we have any shot or any progress towards being holy, it's going to begin there. And so, having said all that, and understanding that God's purpose for us is holiness. He's told us several times, you be holy because God says, I'm holy. So as we know him, he's bringing us to matching what he is. So as we look at this, here's the question for us to begin tonight. How does this goal that God has for us, becoming holy, our sanctification, how does that shape our understanding of every event and circumstance and situation of our lives? If I am under the impression that God's goal for me is happiness, and something doesn't make me happy, what might my response be? To say, doesn't God want me to be happy? And this does not make me happy. So either God's not who I think he is, or something's wrong, And, there are people who are under that impression that God's goal in life is to make you happy. Now, I'm not saying God's goal is to make you miserable. But if God's goal is our holiness first, how does that help me understand everything that might be going on in my life? Okay. So whatever the circumstance might be, okay. So I understand that if I have this situation in front of me, and maybe it's one I really like. Maybe I got a big raise at work. Or maybe it is, I had a heart attack and I'm in the hospital. Now these are two extremes, right? And if I think God's goal is my happiness, well, one seems to go with that, one not so much. But if I understand that God's goal for me is holiness, how I interact with those two things might be different, as opposed to if I think God's goal is my happiness. As we look at this goal of holiness tonight, there's a couple of things I want us to keep in mind. This is our sanctification, our holiness. This is a long-term goal. This is not something God accomplishes in our life in the first 6 weeks after our salvation. At least as far as how our lives actually look. This is something that God will spend our lifetime developing within us. That God has a long-term timeline. God's operating in our best interests. Our holiness is in our best interests. But that doesn't mean that things are going to necessarily be the way I want them to be over the next 6 months or the next even 6 years. It might mean that God's holiness is going to take some circumstances in my life that I may not really particularly enjoy. What might be best for us isn't always what's most comfortable for us. Is that? We understand that, don't we? And we understand that in not just holiness, but we understand that in all kinds of areas, right? How often is the food that you like the most also the best food for you? Is it? It never. Yeah. So, okay, I'm just curious. What is the food that you enjoy the most, that makes you the happiest? Pizza. Mexican cherry what? Okay. Okay. Cake. Just cake. Yeah. Spaghetti. All right. Absolutely. Now, some of us know that just because you like it and it's good and it tastes good and and it makes you happy, means it probably means it isn't good for you, right? That's the first stuff they tell you to not eat. What's best for us isn't always what we enjoy the most or what we're even the most comfortable with. When God's doing what's in our best interest as far as bringing us into holiness and bringing us into a right relationship with Him, it doesn't necessarily mean that the next few future months or even years might be what's most comfortable or enjoyable for me personally, but it might be what's actually best for me in the long run. So God has, in this goal of holiness, a long-term timeline. This is a long-term thing. And by the way, don't forget that our God is a God who's planned this stuff out from before creation. He has a long-term thing going on here. So don't think that the God who created and who's been working out the plan of salvation for thousands of years between creation and between the arrival of Christ, and obviously has been since then as well, don't think that He believes that a few decades of your life is too short. I mean, He's working on a long-term plan, okay? Secondly, this, God does not seek our misery. He doesn't seek our suffering, but He's not going to avoid using it to accomplish His purposes. All right? Thirdly, God's goals for our holiness, for my holiness, for your holiness, is the same for all of His people around us. So that might mean that sometimes our situations, it might mean that the situations I'm going through, whether pleasant or unpleasant as far as I'm concerned, sometimes might not have anything to do with me. They might have something to do with what God wants to do in your life, and vice versa. Because sometimes God does things in my life, He's really trying to do something in your life too. Sometimes God uses us in each other's lives. So sometimes the things I'm going through, while they might be developing some holiness in me, also might be there to help someone else come to the Lord or develop someone else's relationship to the Lord. That's all possible. So the question for us is, this is what Sissy was getting to a second ago, I think. When we encounter any circumstance or any situation, the question is for us, how can, in that circumstance, I develop holiness? How is God going to use us to develop holiness? That is, how does this situation going to enable me to more greatly know the Lord and to reflect Him in His character? How will this move me towards holiness? Not how will it move me towards happiness or personal enjoyment of life, but how will this move me towards holiness? If our lives are to look like Him, to reflect His character, our lives will always be contrary to and stand out from the world around us. They just always will. So Paul's pointed this out. This is actually where Paul's going in chapter 4. He says to us, God's goal for you is sanctification, becoming holy. Now, the first thing he talked about last week we saw in those next 5 verses was the area of sexual purity, sexual behavior. And this is going to be a way that we understand the church will stand out from the society in which it lives. Now, this isn't unique to us. We don't have to think too hard about how the church would stand out in a biblical worldview of this topic today, but this is not new. If you were in the ancient Roman world that the church lived in here, Thessalonica, the truth is a godly sexual lifestyle would stand out then too. All the issues we have today in our world regarding this issue were there 2,000 years ago as well. There's nothing new under the sun, so to speak. So today people would see a God-based, biblically based understanding of the role of sex and sexual behavior. They would see that perhaps as restrictive, as unnecessary. Some would even say it's hateful. And of course the bottom line is none of that is true. They are standards of holiness. First of all, these are standards of holiness for those who belong to the Lord. So for those whose lives are intended to match the Lord, match the God of creation, these things he talked about in verses 3 to 8 are one way that's going to happen. But because these standards originate from God who created us, they're not just guardrails, but they're actually beneficial. They're actually, we understand them to know that these guidelines for sexual behavior, as listed in verses 3 to 8, are actually something that will be profitable for human blessing and human flourishing. The truth is, we know this in every area of our life. There are rules, aren't there? There are restrictions. Some of you may know, if you care about sports, college football begins this weekend. The Razorbacks played their first game. Yes. Now, some of you probably couldn't care less, I can tell. Some of us are really rather excited. Now, whether it's football, baseball, whether it's the marching band, whatever it might be, if there are no rules, is there a game? No, you have. Yeah, if there's no rules, there's no game. There's no out of bounds. There's no point. The rules are what make the game even remotely possible. The truth is, in the life that we've been created for, there are some certain things that God has put in place that make life possible. And this is one of them. And those things will obviously reflect the nature of the Creator. On even a more basic level, there are physical rules to life on this earth. There is something called gravity. Now, I can all day long deny gravity exists. But if I jump off the roof of this church, what happens? I fall. Now, depending on what precautions I take, I may or may not come out of that okay, but if I jump off the building thinking I'm going to fly, does that make it possible for me to actually fly? Just because I think so? No, because the rules are, real life is, gravity. I do some swimming. And one of the difficult things I don't like about swimming, I like the workout, I like the exercise I get, but it's hard. Have you noticed it's hard to breathe underwater? In fact, it's not really hard to breathe. It's impossible to breathe underwater if you're a human being. If I try to breathe underwater, if I take a big breath underwater, what happens? I probably drown. Well, I don't like that rule. Well, doesn't matter whether I like it or not. If I disobey the rule, life ends for me. The truth is, life is full of these situations. And so these things that God's giving us are not only just mere reflections of His holiness, and we're supposed to, as Christians in particular, reflect that holiness. They are, in fact, profitable for life, whether we like them or not. Now, having established that and reviewing a little bit from what we talked about last week, verse 9 moves us forward. He said, now, not only is there verses 3 to 8, like we talked about last week, not only is holiness going to be in this area of sexual behavior, in verse 9 he says, now, as to the love of the brethren, this is, the word brethren really has the idea of family. This is the church loving one another. So there's all different kinds of contexts of love that we as Christians are supposed to have for others. We're supposed to love our neighbor. But the context of this in particular is the brotherhood, the church of the family of God, if you will, and their love for one another. He says there in verse 9, you have no need for anyone to write to you about this. You yourselves are taught by God to love one another. In fact, for indeed you do practice it toward all the brethren who are in all Macedonia. We've seen this actually a couple times. We talked about it in chapter 3. We talked about it in chapter 2. The church in Thessalonica was known. They had a reputation for loving the brotherhood, for loving the church, for loving one another. And Paul has already talked to them a couple times about how his prayer for them is that they, as much as they love one another, that they would do it even more. In fact, he says it right here in verse 10. He commends them. He goes, you guys do this well. You know it. You do it. I don't even have to talk to you about it anymore. But that being said, as good as you do it, he says, by the way, you don't just love your local congregation. You love all the Christians in all of Macedonia. Now, that would include the three other churches and communities that Paul started fellowships in the area of Macedonia. Would have included the city of Philippi, the Philippian church, as well as the city of Berea. If you remember that in Acts, he goes from Philippi to Berea to Thessalonica. So all three of these communities are in the same general area of a region called Macedonia. Now, he would have also probably passed through other towns in the area, but we don't have any record necessarily of him starting churches in those towns. But at least those three. And he says, you guys have a reputation not only for loving your own local congregation, but you love the brothers, so to speak, in Philippi and in Berea as well. He said, you guys do such a great job of this. I don't need to talk to you about it, but my prayer still is this. You guys keep excelling. And we talked about this last week too, or at least a couple weeks ago. Sometimes we feel like we're doing something pretty good. My prayer life is really good right now. Or I'm doing a great job of doing Bible study. Or I've been to church 3 weeks in a row. Whatever it might be. I wrote a big tithe check this week. Whatever it might be. I've done something pretty good. And once we feel like we've accomplished something or we figure something out, what do we tend to do? Slack. Cruise control, right? Well, Paul's saying I might don't take the foot off the gas. You're doing it well, but that doesn't mean you don't need to be moving towards greater excellence, becoming more of that. Now, one question might be this. We've already kind of answered that, but he says, as to the love of the brethren. Now, if we've been in church a lot, we probably understand who this is talking about. We might ask the question, who's the brethren? Who are the brothers he's talking about here? Well, yeah, it's fellow Christians. That's exactly who it is. Those who have believed and followed Jesus. Now, how do I know who that is? Okay, you should be able to tell, right? Now, again, if we're in the context of the early church in Thessalonica, how do they know who are believers and who aren't? I mean, they don't have a building the way we do. They don't have, a computer with a church roll on it. How do they know who the other believers are? How do they know who the brethren is? Well, they love one another, but how do they know who's in and who's out? Secret handshake. How did people? Has that been passed down? Has that been passed down? That secret handshake, Bob? Do you know what that is? Okay. You guys are just in a really good spot. How would they have in the first century? How would the believers have identified themselves? Don't make this more complicated than it is, guys. Y'all know the answer to this. How do you make your proclamation public? How do you identify with Christ? How do you identify in that day and age? Huh? Baptism. Yeah. Yeah, you're all going, oh yeah, I do that. Yes. Baptism, this is what baptism does. Baptism that means, because understand, they don't have a building with a nice little baptism in there that only you can see. If you're going to get baptized then, where are you going to get baptized at? River. And understand the river then, again, they don't have running water either in the city. So where does everyone goes to the river to get their water for laundry to drinking water, cooking. Everybody's down there. So if you're getting baptized down there, everyone sees, right? So, and we've talked about this before, even today in parts of the world, baptism, that's when you kind of, baptism isn't what saves you. It's not what makes you a Christian, but that's the moment that you are publicly identified as one. And once you take that step, that's when everyone around you knows he's one of them, she's one of them. Now, by the way, this is why we, even as a church right here, require baptism to be a member of the church. Now, we recognize and understand that maybe someone who moved in from somewhere else, or maybe grew up in a different congregation, may have already been baptized, and we'll recognize and accept that baptism when they come in, if they've been baptized according to the New Testament, that is immersed, following a profession of faith. But baptism is that's essentially the entry point into a congregation today. So we may keep track of membership, and by the way, this is why membership is a big deal. We not all, unfortunately, not all local congregations talk about membership anymore, but the New Testament, that would be a foreign idea. The mechanics of being a, quote, member of a church may be different than it was 2,000 years ago, but the concept of membership back then was essential. So the idea of just, for lack of a better term, dating a church versus marrying the church would have been a foreign concept. Now we understand that there's some differences in the situations, but this is why that's a big deal. So because there's so much of the New Testament that talks about those who are in and out of the faith, or in or out of the congregation, or in or out of the family, so to speak. It should be, and unfortunately some people don't think it is, but it in fact actually is. Now it doesn't mean that somebody's not a believer if they're not a member of a local congregation. It doesn't mean that. But probably, I mean, in fact, Ephesians chapter 5 actually does make this fairly explicit. The Bible talks about, it uses marriage as a metaphor for the church and our relationship to Christ. Or actually, I should say, it uses, that's a way of saying it. And so what we can say with some degree of accuracy is this. Ladies, guys for that matter, how happy would you have been with your, say, now spouse if they had said to you, hey, I love you, I want to spend the rest of my life to you, I just don't want to get hitched, I just don't want to get married, I don't want to make it known. I want to spend my life with you, I just don't want anybody to know about it. Now, how many of y'all would have said, that was the proposal I've been waiting for? Or ladies, if the guy had said that to you, what might have been your answer? So long. I mean, I'm just thinking about those guys who go to the, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but those guys that go to like the baseball games and propose. And can you just imagine this on the big screen at center field? Whatever her name is, he's asking you to marry him. Just don't tell anybody, which is kind of ironic that you'd be on the big screen. But now that I think about that, of course, the truth is, being a part of a congregation is a covenant relationship where you say to the church, and the church says to you, we are in this together following Christ. And we're accountable to one another. We're going to hold each other. We're going to support one another. We're going to love one another. We're going to hold each other accountable. We're going to correct one another. It's a covenant relationship. And so this is what it means to be part of a church. And this is all underpinning and undergirding what Paul's talking about here. This is required. This is necessary. Now, in that context, he says this. We're going to move past verses 9 and 10. Verse 11, and he says, make it your ambition. Now, before we get to what the ambition is, if someone says, I want you to, if something is your ambition, what is it? What is it to you? If it's your ambition, what is it to you? Your goal, your dream. Anybody ever had any ambitions in life? What were some of your ambitions? Maybe you've reached them all. Is an ambition or goal something you kind of go, I kind of hope it happens, we'll see. I'm just going to hang out here and see if it happens to me. Something you work for. Something you prepare for. Something you set up as a goal and move towards with your effort, correct? Is that what an ambition or a goal would be? Okay. So this is what he's talking. He said, this is to be your ambition. So this is what he's about to lay out for us. It's not something we just kind of hope sort of happens along the way. This is a goal, Paul states for the church there at Thessalonica. Your goal, your ambition is to lead a quiet life. Now, that's probably not what we were anticipating if we were just to stop at ambition. To lead, in fact, he goes on, to lead a quiet life, he helps us to kind of understand what that is. He says, to attend to your own business and work with your hands so that you will behave properly toward outsiders and not be in need. All right. So to lead a quiet life. Now, there's a couple different aspects to this. This actually has the idea of a peaceable life. So one aspect of this would be to not be leading a life that is, you might say, looking for trouble. I'm not going to ask any of you guys how many times throughout your life you've looked for trouble, because some of you, I know the answer. I'm not looking at you. uh, there is here for Paul, and understand the context that they're in. They're in the early Roman Empire, or the middle of the first century. You guys don't need to be out there looking for trouble. Now, understand, trouble sometimes comes when you're walking with the Lord and you're trying to be holy. In fact, I think we could probably say, if we really are living lives of true holiness, enough trouble is going to show up on your front door that you really have to look for it. In fact, Jesus actually makes that point multiple times, because our lives will look different. In fact, if we remember the story of Thessalonica, when Paul went there and began the church there, began the work there, early on there is opposition. And in fact, the opposition is so strong that it appears that Paul was staying at a guy's house named Jason. And the troublemakers that were there in Thessalonica actually go to Jason's house and drag him out and take him before the court and accuse him of harboring troublemakers like Paul. Now, Paul wasn't actually causing trouble. It was the people who were showing up against Paul that were causing the trouble. And Jason wasn't doing anything. He was just letting this guy stay in his house who had led him to the Lord. Trouble showed up anyway. So you can imagine someone like Jason goes, I'm not looking for trouble. I got enough just by being a believer. Truth is, if we're being holy, we're going to have enough issues on our plate dealing with the world as it is without looking for trouble. So he says, lead, or make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, a life that's settled, a life that's calm, a life that's looking for peace. Now, by the way, this does not mean, and we'll look at this next thing, he talks about attending to your own business. This does not mean a life that's uninvolved with the people around you. That's not what this means. This does not mean, and I understand that the early church wouldn't have had this option. You and I do, because of where we live and what time we live. We have the option now here in the U.S. as citizens and as residents of the United States. We have the option, and I think even the obligation, to be part of our democracy, to vote, to exercise that's part of our citizenship in this country, to do that. Now, the early church, they didn't have that option. They lived in the Roman Empire. They had no say. They live in a dictatorship. So they do what they're told to do as far as a legal government side. So, they don't have any options there, but you and I do. So I would say this does not mean that we are uninvolved. It does mean this, that we aren't to be a panicky, overreactive, all over the place people. If there is a people right now in our country who should be calm, doesn't mean we're not truth speaking, but if there are people who should be calm, who should not be panicky, who should be level-headed, who should be looking for the truth, who shouldn't be passing on lies and shouldn't be overreacting, it should be us. And you and I know right now, it doesn't take much watching the news to look for people that, it's hard to find people right now out there who are all these things we've talked about that are calm and at peace. It's hard. If there's a people that should be, it is us. We did a study in Revelation a couple years ago, and one of the reasons I did that study a couple years ago, because I'd resisted doing one in Revelation for a long time, was that one of the things I was seeing kind of in the general conversation, whether it was on social media or otherwise, where Christians in particular, but people in general, it's the end of the world, they're getting all panicky. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, even if it is the end of the world in the next couple of years, if you're a believer, I'm not saying there won't be some unpleasant times. The Bible describes some pretty difficult circumstances for believers in the end times. It describes things like martyrdom and being outcast. But we've been told it's going to happen. In fact, we've been told it has to happen. So why would we be panicking like we were scared of that, like we didn't think this was going to happen when we were told it was? We should be a people who lead a quiet life, who are peaceable, who are not panicky, who are settled, Um, Again, it doesn't mean that we look the other way when someone's being harmed or victimized or hurt. Doesn't mean we ignore someone who's hurting or in danger. It basically does mean don't be a troublemaker. Don't be looking for opportunities to complain and to cause trouble. Don't seek out conflict. Trust me, if you're being holy, you'll get enough. The problem for us mostly is that we're not really all that holy. And so we, maybe that's a little judgmental, I don't know. But if we're holy, we're going to court conflict because people don't like holiness. They just don't. So, and again, this is an ambition. That means that Paul's understanding that this might not just kind of happen by accident. That we need to work towards and have an intentionality towards a quiet life, a peaceable life. Now, he goes on to explain that. Some more, he says, to attend to your own business. We might just say it this way, mind your own business. Now, I'm curious. Well, no, I'm not curious. I know the answer. What would our world look like right now if people just minded their own business? It'd be a lot calmer, wouldn't it? I've been in churches for 30-something years. And I'm going to say this, that the 6.5 years I've been here and it's not even close, have been the most peaceable 6.5 years I've ever been at a church ever. It just is. And I'm telling you, it's not even close. The relative peace we have here in this congregation is just something I'm just telling you, I love and appreciate it because I just haven't seen that level of extended peace anywhere else I've been. Because people don't mind their own business and because they're not really ambitiously living a quiet life. They just aren't. And for sure they aren't living it towards each other. He says to, essentially, it literally has this idea of take care of yourself. Tend to your own issues. Tend to your own stuff here. I want to, there's a couple different parallel ideas here. Luke chapter 12, Jesus is sharing, I want to read for you here, chapter 12, verses 42 and 43. And Jesus has been telling a parable about some servants or some slaves, and he's wrapping up this parable, and he says to the disciples, if that slave, the Lord said, who then is the faithful and sensible steward whom his master will put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at the proper time? Blessed is the slave or servant whom his master finds so doing when he comes. If you're referencing earlier stuff, in other words, blessed is the servant who's doing what I told him to do. And when I show back up, he's just doing the task I told him to do, not trying to do everybody else's job. I mentioned football season here just a few, listen to some pregame stuff about the Razorback game coming up, and the first game of the year is this coming Saturday. And one of the things everybody's talking about is one of the best things you do to have a good first game is have everyone out there just do their job. If those 11 guys will each want to do their job, things work out pretty good. It's when you have one guy that doesn't do his job or one guy trying to do two people's job that trouble starts. Just do your job. And Jesus is saying that parable, among other things, blessed is the one who, when I show back up, is doing what I told him to do. I gave him a job, and he's just doing that. Blessed is that guy. So this takes some level of intentional, purposeful prep and practice. To make it our ambition to lead a quiet life and to attend to our own business. He goes on to say, to work with your own hands, just as we commanded you. Now, this has the idea of manual labor. So does this mean if you have a white-collar job, you have to quit it and go to work as a tradesman? No, that's not the point here. The point is to be about work and doing well, to do your job and do your job well. he is talking to them about their behavior as believers in that congregation. One's supposed to be loving one another, and then on top of that, to be leading a quiet life, to be calm and peaceable at will, to be minding and taking care of their own business, and be at work. Work hard, produce. We don't talk about this much in the church, but there is, I think in the New Testament in particular, and Paul talks about this quite a bit, there is what we might call a theology of work. Christians are not to be a lazy people. Now, Paul is going to deal with this in more detail really in 2 Thessalonians. There seemed to be within the Thessalonian church an anticipation of Christ's second coming. And they believed that Christ's second coming was so close that some of them were just kind of going, well, what's the point of going to work? He's going to come back next couple of days anyway. So I don't really have to go back to work. So they just stopped working. Well, when Christ didn't come back after a few days or a few weeks, that person who hasn't been working is now what? Hungry. That's exactly right. They hadn't got that rent paid. So now they're relying upon someone else to help them pay their rent and get them fed. And Paul said, would you get off your rear end and get back to work? Now, we'll talk about that more in 2 Thessalonians, where Paul will spend a lot more time on that. But there's a sequence here where Paul's talking about how they are to be loving one another, how to be treating one another, how to be behaving as those who are attending their own business and working. And he says there in verse 12, so that, for this end, so that you will behave or be treated properly, you may have the word walk properly, toward outsiders and not be in any need. In other words, we are to be living lives in such a way that we're taking care of our business and we're not relying upon unbelievers to support us. This is one of those things that I spent a long time in youth ministry, and one thing that, especially when I first came into youth ministry in around 1990, I was going to say the 1990s, but it actually was 1990. That's pretty popular was I got two kinds of mass mail-outs when I first started youth ministry in 1990. One was T-shirts. There's all kinds of T-shirt companies out there that want you to buy T-shirts. So I was getting mail-outs for all kinds of T-shirts, all kinds of youth conferences. And the third one was fundraising. How do you pay for your kids to go to youth camp, or how do you pay for your kids to go on whatever trip you want them to go through, whatever else? And it has all these fundraisers. You can go out there, and it's all the same thing in schools. You can go sell candy bars, do car washes, all that stuff. And I never really did any of that. And one of the reasons was, it always felt awkward to me that as a church who believes that God's going to provide what he calls us to do, it felt awkward to me to go to a bunch of unbelievers and say, we need your help to do what God told us to do. It always felt awkward to me. And as through the years, I realized I'm not the only one. There's a lot of us in that same boat. I don't think I'm unique. I'm not the first one who came up with that idea by any stretch of the imagination. But it always felt awkward to me for, as a Christian, say, we think God told us to do this, so we need all you non-Christians out there to pay for it for us because we can't do it ourselves. Now, if somebody wants to help, that's fine. I'm not saying we'll turn the check down. But that just always felt awkward to me. Now, have we done fundraisers through the years? Yes, but we did them in-house, so to speak. Part of that is an application of this principle here. There is a way the church, now I don't mean to say someone's just sinning if they don't agree with me there. That's not my intention. But that's part of where I'm coming from on that. It's one reason why the way we don't do outside fundraisers here. Paul's essentially telling them, you as a group of people need to be handling your business. And doing so in a way that will, as the world out here looks at you and sees what you're doing, you go, well, we may think they're nuts for believing that guy resurrected from the dead, but that's a honorable, God-fearing, hard-working people that live lives that are worthy of respect. That's what Paul's basically saying. Live this way. All right. There's actually, I thought we might not get through those 4 verses. We're pretty much done. We'll wrap up a little bit that next week, but it's time for us to be done tonight. But you get the main point tonight, right? Take care of your business. Don't look for trouble. Live lives that are honorable in the way you treat others, treat one another in particular. Doesn't mean if you need help, you don't get help. All right? But it does mean you work. It does mean you take care of your stuff. It means you don't go looking for trouble. It means you don't stick your nose down other people's business. All right? We know what all that looks like, hopefully. All right. If you're watching with us tonight, so grateful you did. Hope you will be with us on Sunday morning as we continue our study in the book of Exodus. And y'all have a good evening. All right. Let's take some time to pray. I'll say goodbye to the folks there online. Do you guys have some prayer requests tonight?